Okay, hello everyone. Welcome today to this the third lunch lecture about computational typography. Thank you for joining. I see already in the chat there's people from all over the world, so that's really great. Before we start, I just want to thank a few people for making this possible. So first of all, I'm Vera. I'm in the Future Sketches group at the MIT Media Lab. So I'd like to thank the MIT Media Lab for making this happen and letting us do this. Also, I want to thank Zach Lieberman, who is my BI, and he's also here and helping me today with the moderation. And we have an amazing ASL interpreter, Blair Fell. So if you need any interpreting, you can find him here in the Zoom. So thank you so much for doing that. And just a quick note that this will be recorded. So we'll post all the lunch lectures after the series is over so that we can properly transcribe them. Yeah, so we're very excited for today's lecture, which is Talia Cotton. I'm super curious to see more of her work. We've already had Space Type Studio with us and Jos van Rossum, and in the coming weeks we'll hear from Peter Cho, Beatrice Lozano, and Dia Studio. And just two quick notes before we start the lecture of today. So one of them is that the MIT Media Lab has a faculty search with tenure track for an assistant professor or associate professor in transformative design. So we'll post the link in the chat here if you are interested or if you know anyone that might be interested in that. And then secondly, Future Sketches, which is the research group I am in, is looking for applicants for the next year. So we are a group that basically explores the essence of code as a medium for art and design. And we make artifacts and tools in the creative realm using code. So if that's something you might be interested in, we're going to have an information hour on October 4th. At 10 a.m. Boston time. So we'll post a link in the chat as well if that's anything you might be interested in or you know anyone that is. So those were just two quick announcements, but let's go to the lecture. So I'm really excited about this one. So today we have Talia Cotton with us, and you might know her from her super playful website or some of her work. So she's a designer and a coder and an educator, and she recently founded a creative agency called Cotton, and she also teaches intro and advanced coding at Parsons, the School of Design, and she's worked all over the place. I'm sure you've actually seen her work, even if you don't know it. She worked for Pentagram, and she's won prizes like Responsible Designer to Watch, the Young Guns Award for creative professionals under 30, and has work all around the Type Directors Club, the One Club, TDC, the Fast Company, and it's nice that. So yeah, I'm very excited to welcome her here today. Please give a big applause for Talia.
Thank you so much, Vera. Let me go ahead and share everything. Hold on one second. That's not what I want to click. Let's do the presentation. There we go. And it looks like that's working just fine. I'm going to just assume that that's good. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. MIT Media Lab Lunch Lectures. If any of you have been to any talks that I have given, and if you've been to more than one talk that I have given, you're weird. But if you have, you will know that I don't like giving the same talk more than once. What I like to do is I like to understand the audience. I assess where design and technology is at a certain period of time when I'm giving that talk. And as you all know, that stuff moves really quickly, so I can't just recycle a talk. The name of this talk is the sentence that was sent to me when I was asked to come here, which is, the name of this talk is called, "We are interested in the role computation plays in your various online typography works, as well as hearing about your recent Foundation of Design agency, Cotton." So we'll be talking about a little bit of both of those things. And just to kick off, actually, even before we kick off, I wanted to say this is the first time that I'm actually talking about some of the work that I've been doing as a company, which is very exciting. It's also very vulnerable. You're going to see some things that are in progress at the end. I may, if there's time at the very end, talk about even what it's like, what it has been like to sort of run this company. All very exciting, but cut me some slack here, because it's the first time that I'm throwing out some of these projects that you're going to see, and the first time that I am presenting some things. Let's start with just this idea of computation, because that was sort of like the very first thing that was in this title, the computation and typography. And believe it or not, when I was looking into this, I even asked myself, okay, so what is computation? Like, how is computation even defined? I know what computation is, don't worry, but I wanted to ask myself how it's defined. And I was very happy to find out that by some definitions, computation is the action of mathematical calculation. By other definitions, very similar, it's the act or action of computing calculation. So this idea of calculation, and even sometimes specifically mathematical calculation, is what is considered computation. I love this. If any of you are also crazy enough to follow me and know that I have in one of my reels on Instagram, or in my highlights, I have a math highlight reel. I'm a designer and I have a math highlight reel because I love math. Here are some of the things in that reel. This is understanding the math behind typography. In this particular one, I was creating a variable typeface that was variable according to the browser width and the browser height. In order to do that, you have to understand trigonometry, you have to understand a little bit of measurements, you have to understand the architecture of typography and understand that the letter form is not going to look similar when it is in a narrow place than when it would be in a very wide place. And to do this, there's a lot of math involved. This is that same project that was, once I sort of took it on from paper, bringing it into this, at this point, this was Illustrator. This was way back in 2018. Just sort of like kept making calculations there. This is me using a calc in CSS to do something that you guys should never do this. This is also back in 2019, and this is definitely should have been a lot more automated, but I was loving this. I was loving using math. In class, we go over, if anyone knows what this is called, go ahead and shout it out in your room, muted, because this is the Pythagorean theorem. In class, we talk about SOHCAHTOA. If anyone remembers SOHCAHTOA, good for you. Even if you don't remember what SOHCAHTOA does, if you remember that SOHCAHTOA is a thing, that's pretty cool too. And we do this for trigonometry, for making calculations about things on the page. This was the most recent one in my highlight reel. This was a year ago. This was a project where I was, well, let's actually zoom into this for a second. This took a little bit more calculation than I typically had been doing at that time. And by the way, every project that you use calculation for gets more and more complicated. And this one, what I was trying to do was, the output for this one was, this was a little project that I was doing for a friend of mine. A friend of mine had asked me to do his website, and I said, okay, but I'm going to have to make it fun. And the idea here, actually, the calculation here, if we were to think about this, is that it's sort of like randomly assigning a position for the arrow. The letter forms then have to understand where that position is relative to where it is right now. So there's a lot of like understanding that angle, taking that out angle and figuring out position. That's trigonometry. And then the letter forms, which aren't in the exact same place as the arrow, they have to sort of like follow it, which is really cool. To make this even more complicated, and this was really where the calculation came in, on the actual website, it's not just that it bounces around the page, because things have to have a function. It can't just be sort of like an experimental moment to play with. This way, his little logo is sort of like moving between all the other links on his website. This was really hard because it had to be a certain specific place on the x-axis. It couldn't just be randomly around the page. So, and this is a thing we're going to see a lot today, is this idea of in design, there's a lot of experimentation, but then there's a lot of really deliberate movements. And I think really the way to get there is the idea of computation, calculating exactly how to get there. Just to give a little bit of context on this site and to talk about that idea about design just a little bit more. Garrett, my friend Garrett, whose website we just saw, his work, he works at an agency called Order Design. His work is very orderly, it's very clean, it's very beautiful. He has a direction for everything. He has a reason for everything that he does. When he came to me, he said, hey, I know you code. Can you just like make this website? You don't have to do anything special. Really, like, I don't want to take up too much of your time. Can you just make this? He comped this up. He said, this is what I want it to be. And I said, yes, absolutely, but I'm going to make it fun. And really, just looking at this, I was looking for like that one thing, that one design element that sort of like tells his story. Luckily, it's that arrow. Every single link on this thing, sort of the one design element that this website does have is that arrow. And with that arrow, that's sort of like where I got the idea of, okay, we have to use this arrow for something. The arrow also means directionality. And that's where we sort of tie it back to the really cool logo thing. So this is sort of like, I sort of told that story backwards. I started with the computation, and then I went through to the idea where it sort of started from. But really, that process goes the other way around in all of my work and in all the work that we see here today. The first step is to understand what you want to communicate. The second step is figuring out what visual ways we're going to have to use to communicate that. And the third and final step is that computation, is the calculating exactly how to get there. And if you think about it, that's been the history of graphic design. It's been, even back in the 50s and 60s, they had to make their own forms of calculation and computation, or maybe not using a computer, but calculation in order to get certain things to look a certain way. And that was what blew people's minds back then. And we are doing the same thing now, but the idea is the most important thing. Now, so that's my process. It's very heavily rooted in math. It's not always rooted in math, but math always comes into it because, again, it's about calculating how you want to get there and how you want to communicate that idea. Now, before you guys jump to the conclusion of, wait, but does this mean that I have to be good at math in order to do the work that I do? To you, I will tell you what I tell my students who say that same thing, who say I'm bad at math. I'm going to tell you to shut up. I'm going to say there's no such thing as being bad at math. You're not bad at math. Shut up, shut that up right now. You are not bad at math. And just to give you a little bit of context of that, and this is something that I have proven to every single one of the classes that I have taught, there's no such thing as being bad at math, because humans aren't inherently bad at math. What my theory is that people who may believe or may think that they are bad at math, it likely comes down to, at some point in your education, you may have had a teacher who didn't necessarily explain math in a way that your brain works, which isn't a bad thing because everyone learns differently. And so if you're thinking I'm bad at math, then rethink that for a second. And just to, again, give that a little bit of context, this was little baby me and my 16th birthday. Around this period of time, I had a mega crush on my math teacher, Mr. Krause. And on my birthday, I just remember thinking, like this is the period where people were like thinking about, the cute boy in school. I was thinking about my math teacher. I loved math, and it was because I had a really, really great math teacher. So that's just sort of like a side note. You're not bad at math. Just to paint a picture of sort of where this love of math, where it came from. When I was in high school, I also used to make these math comics. This one was Super Phi and the Attack of the Evil Geometric Shapes. Just zooming into this, it's just about the geometric shapes that go in and they take over the numbers. And I like this one particularly. The 7 is going into the super turbo square rutilator 4000, and when the 7 comes out, or when it comes out, the square root of 15 says it could be worse. Look what happened to -5. And -5 is not there because why, everybody? Shout it out in your room, muted, because negative numbers become imaginary when you take the square root of them. Very good. So obviously I loved math. But in high school, I also obviously loved creativity. I dove into design. I was one of those weirdos who like knew all the weird Photoshop filters that you could do to make everyone look a certain way. And when it came time to apply to colleges, I asked myself, what now? Now, if I love creativity and I love logic and math, what now? And the second chapter is called You're Just Going to Have to Make One Up. And this has been another theme that started at this point in my life, at this point when I had to decide where I wanted to go to school. And when it came time to go to school, I was really about this question: what am I going to study? Do I pursue the route of logic or logic, or do I pursue creativity? And I'm sure many of you in the room have that same question. If you became a designer, chances are it's because you liked the idea of creativity, but you wanted to apply it in some sort of logical way. At the time, coding wasn't a thing. That wasn't like an industry. That wasn't a thing that people did. And I remember at this period in time, my mother would used to joke. She used to say, "Oh, you love creativity and you love logic so much. Well, the right career doesn't exist for you. You're just going to have to make one up." And at that time, I was an angsty teenager, and I was like, "Mom, you can't just make up a career. You can't just do that." But this was really that question that rang in my head. And when it came time to ask this question, I actually said, well, I'm not going to pursue creativity. I'm going to pursue money. I'm going to choose a career that pays, because creativity doesn't pay. Both my parents were musicians, and I saw that firsthand. They lived a very stressful life. So I said, I'm going to pursue the logical side. I went to Carnegie Mellon for a few years. I studied business and psychology, and I loved it. It was great. However, like so many of you, maybe if you've done this little career switch, you can relate to this idea that you just sort of didn't get that creative side of things. So then eventually, after a few years, I transferred to Parsons School of Design, where I studied communication design, and so on and so forth. I'm going to zoom through this section because if you've been to other talks, I don't want to spend too much time on my background. I want to get to the fun stuff. But at Parsons, just the idea of calculating to get certain things and experimenting with techniques automative techniques that happen. This was taking a bunch of pieces of paper. I think I printed on 2,000 pieces of paper and then scanned it at 3,000 DPI in a scanner to create this poster and to create the many different iterations of what these things were. This was before I took my one and only coding class. I did take a one and only coding class. When I went into that coding class, I said to myself, this isn't going to be for me. I tried that whole logic thing. I studied business and psychology at Carnegie Mellon. I'm not going to like coding. I ended up loving coding. The very first project that I ever did was a game called Give the Cat a Pizza. This was when I say this was my first project, this was the very first project that I did outside of a coding class. I spent extra time. This was on my birthday, the year that I learned how to code. I said that for my birthday, I want to make something with code, and this is what I did. It was super fun. Now, fast forward, school was also amazing. The school was amazing because I now had discovered coding. I was now using it in all of my projects, not just the ones in the single coding class that I took, but also in all my other design classes. And then it came time to apply to jobs. And you sort of have the same question of, well, and this was rewind several years ago before sort of designing in code was really talked about that much. I got a job at a design agency, and thus began sort of like my career direction, sort of what I started doing in my career. And the theme was, as you've seen on this slide, it's been up for a couple seconds now, is that it has never not been hard to find the right role for a designer coder like me. And I'm sure everybody in the audience who's even touched coding, even just a little bit, has probably still sort of like lived with this question for a minute. Well, I know how to code really well, or I really like coding and I really like design, but where do I fit? Where do I go? And this was, again, that same question back when I was applying to schools. Now, so I started off, my first real job was as the digital lead at Champions Design, which they're known for making gorgeous, amazing, visually compelling graphics. They have an amazing, seamless brand system that they apply to, or brand process that they apply to all of their systems. I got really good at understanding branding there. I got really good at understanding what clients are going to want. So I was able to develop that side of me. When I was there, I also started to play with the idea of just playing around with code and making cool things. This was a website that we did for one of the brands that they had developed, which I won't show you the full brand identity, but just to show you that I was playing with the idea of generativity and branding simultaneously. Those of you who've heard me speak know that I hate generative logos. I think that that's a failure of a logo, because a logo should be a single stamp. But this was me playing, and this was where I learned that. This was where I learned that a logo that kind of like moves and changes, you have to be very careful. And instead, you made it sort of like a generative system where the brand itself is generative, but the logo is still something that works as a stamp on a piece of paper. Hold that thought about generative logos, by the way, because that's going to come back very soon. I wasn't getting the most out of what I wanted and learning how to code at Champions Design. As much as I loved it, again, it has never not been hard for me to find the right position as a designer coder. And so I left. I did about a year working as an independent designer and developer. And this was where I started to actually develop like full on websites and CMSs and get in the nitty gritty of things. And it was hard. It was hard to sort of like lead the sort of like creative for something that not that many creative designer developers had been doing at the time. One of the projects I was working on during this time was the SVA Masters in Branding, which they actually just recently redid their website. But if you went on their website about just a few weeks ago, you would have seen this sort of like poster tool. These poster tools, this is like old news by now. Like people do poster tools, like people do artwork tools and things like this. And the idea is that to get there, you need a starting point. To get to a moment in time where designers and brands are doing things, you need to explore those and show people what those kind of things can be and what's possible. In this particular one, it was taking the typeface that was designed for this brand and showing off ways that you could almost like use that typeface for really pretty designs. After about a year being an independent designer and developer, that's when I left. That's when I was asked to come and join Pentagram. When I was at Pentagram, I worked on 2 teams. I worked with Georgia Lupi and Michael Beirut. And Georgia has a background in data, and Michael has a background in branding. And I love both of those things. And I also know how to code. And what my job was there was to see how coding could apply to both of these things. And both of these, if the theme of this talk is like computational typography, coding, you could imagine, sort of like comes into the typography of these things very differently. In data, the typography is very important that you see it very fine and it's important that you understand the data. In branding, there's something a little bit more expressive about it, and sort of understanding how code can apply to both of those was really nice. That it wasn't just data and brands; those were the focuses of both of those teams. But I quickly found out that coding started to apply to all design. While I was there, just to throw a few, again, skipping over the stuff that people may have seen already. This is this just came out. This is the Central Park brand identity, and for this brand identity, there's this beautiful display typography for each season. And not that it matters, but the leaves that we got to design these letter forms are literally from Central Park. No one cares. No one would know that, but it's really nice to know that you can do that. But the thing about this typeface is that this isn't an actual typeface that you can type on your keyboard. No. Because this typeface is randomized, the colors in this thing, just to sort of indicate this idea of like the random colored leaves on these words, every time you see a letter, like we'll compare these 2 L's over here, it needs to be sort of like different coloring to sort of give it that sort of like natural feeling. So to do this as part of the job, we also created a typeface generator or a lettering generator where they typed in whatever they wanted. The words just sort of showed up, they clicked on the things, and then the typeface gets exported. This is also something that we see a lot of nowadays. Nowadays, brands are starting to question and ask, how can we create a tool that continues the brand that we can now use to create our things? And this is something that we see a little bit more about now too. When I was at Pentagram, this is sort of on the branding side of things. I also, one of the projects that I'm most proud of is when we did this interactive web experience for Google Arts and Culture for Earth Day a couple years ago, called Plastic in the Air. And the idea here is to visualize the plastic particles in the air, literally like the microplastics that are in the air. And the idea is to draw the user in, tell them, get them to understand where that comes from. This is sort of a reel, sort of to show you a few different bits of what this thing looked like. Now the typography here isn't computational. Instead, the actual way that these graphics are moving around the page and the size and the shape, that was computational. That required a lot of calculation. So much so the sky changed in the background to almost like draw the user in and make them feel like this problem really relates to them if the sky is the same exact color as what it is outside your window. This is a project that I like to bring this one in, actually not because of what it looks like. This one I like to bring in usually because to me, this project is a constant reminder of when I don't think I can do it, just try and you will get there. I just remember distinctly, you know, talking about this project on my team, and this is sort of what we wanted to get to, something that looked like this. And at the time I had only been coding for a few years, and the idea of just making these like random particles fly through space to me was so scary. And I didn't think I could do it. And, you know, a few late nights later, you sort of get there. And this is my way of saying to you guys, if that's what you're doing it right, because that's how you create the things that are new that people can see and get inspired by. They will then try to copy you, and then you can keep doing what you're doing. That's another theme that you'll see a little bit moving on. I'm going to pause there. That's sort of like, that takes me up until a certain distinctive moment in my journey in discovering how computation and typography work together, and how my founding of Cotton. And I'm going to pause here to sort of relay what just the general philosophy behind the work that I do, and what I've sort of discovered after all those years of working with design and code. That's sort of what this is sort of what my ultimate philosophy and takeaway is. If you were to see me give this talk a year ago, this is what I would have had the entire presentation on the next 5 slides. But here it's all summarized. I always start to ask with the question, why do designers code? And all this work that I just showed and the work that you're working on right now, why would code benefit something? When I ask my students, we sort of throw it into 3 buckets. Bucket number 1 is very easy. This is usually the first one that people say. It's the professional advantage. It's the benefits of knowing the basics of coding as a graphic designer in modern times, i.e. to bridge the gap. If you're handing off code, if you're handing off your design to a developer, it will be a lot more seamless if you know just a little bit of CSS if you hand that over. Number 2, form and function. And this is sort of where I get my first-year students to get to understand what the visual outcomes and tools for the design process that differ from standard design methods and outputs. We'll see a list of these in a second, but that's how coding can benefit design in just the way that it looks and the way that it behaves. Interactivity is an example of something that coding can do for design that other methods of designing cannot, or you would have to work a little bit harder to do that. Now, the third and final column is, this is where I teach my advanced students, and this is where I try to make my work focus on. This is where reason and impact. This is a conceptual and philosophical imperative for stronger and more meaningful communication design. For example, to connect people. Now, before we focus on these last 2 just a little bit more, this also sort of falls within a framework. This framework is sort of goes upward, and on one axis you have the level of impact that it gives, and on the other axis you have the amount of skill that it requires to get there. If all you're doing is you're making something beautifully interactive, that's going to require a lot of skill to get there, just to understand how to, again, calculate and compute to that final result. But where my work really where I want to pursue a little bit more is understanding how those methods of form and function can then create deeper reason and impact in graphic design in general. Let's focus on those 2 just a little bit. Again, this is my major summary. These are the visual outcomes and tools for the design process. And these are sort of like a list of 5 things. In the work that I've done, and in any sort of like coding that you look at in the world that's also design, chances are it falls into at least one of these 5 things. It can be either interactive, it responds to the user. It can be generative, it uses random values or some sort of values to create iterations on one system or one visual concept. It can be adaptable, like the poster generator or the type generator. The user can go in and follow the properties and the parameters and sort of adapt the design to create their own thing. It can be automated. This is, if anybody likes for loops, this is what automated does. It sort of does the same thing over and over again. And with that alone, you can do so much more for design in the way that it looks and what we're used to. And it can be data-driven. It can respond to values that are other than the code. It can be constantly evolving values. It could be live data, it could be static data, but it is values nonetheless. What these all have in common, and this is really fundamental in this principle, is that what these all have in common is that unlike every other form of design up until this moment in time where we're using code, suddenly we have to design for factors that are out of our control. In the first one, we're sacrificing part of our role to the user. In the second one, we're sacrificing part of our design to random values. In the third one, it's the user again. In the fourth one, it's automation. You don't know what will happen on that loop. And in the fifth one, it's values that could be ever changing, and you have to make your design sort of like prepare for that. That is really interesting. That idea alone has dictated so much of the work that we all do together. But let's focus a little bit more on this third one, reason and impact, because again, this is where I get really excited. A conceptual and philosophical imperative for stronger and more meaningful communication design. Now, this list is a lot longer, and this list is also always growing. Some things that I have discovered or realized that that using those form and function can do is it can make design to always evolve design, to be current, to make people connect, to be driven by community, to be personal, to represent the idea of uniqueness, to be unbiased, to evoke empathy, and so on and so forth. Now, these are the questions that in my experience working in branding agencies, working with brand strategists and talking about what is like the right thing for you, they don't care about the previous stuff. They don't care about interactivity and generativity. If you say that word, they're going to fire you. This is what they care about. They care about, oh yes, my brand is all about making people connect. So how can we do that with design techniques? At the end of the day, these five in form and function now impact all these things. These are design tools, a new kind of design tool using computation that can now create a whole new realm of design possibilities. And that is sort of like, in a nutshell, what I try to do with my work. As an example of this, and sort of just to wrap up the chapter of just career and getting to where we are today, the project that got me to this, I think this is something that after years and years of working with design and creating generative websites and whatnot, and understanding the inherent qualities of what makes a good generative logo and what makes this is where you start to discover that third column. And the project where I finally started thinking about it like this was GBA. This may be one of my more popular works. I love it. What GBA was it's a design, or it's an arts organization with the mission to give a voice to undiscovered, underrepresented artists, many of whom are minorities. The GBA team, the Guilty by Association team, came to me and they said, we need a brand. And I said, absolutely not. I am not about to take the responsibility on my shoulders to design for an entire group of people who not only have I never met, but we don't know where they are. That's the whole premise of this thing. I cannot be the designer to speak for those people. What the result was, and what sort of where we got to, is this idea of handwriting is the one thing that they all have in common. Artists since the dawn of time have always signed their name in some sort of way on the artwork that they make. So the final thing is sort of this beautiful generative, every single time that you see the logo, it is potentially representing some other artist's signature or handwriting or way of doing art through the logo itself. Now to get here, as I'll talk about this as I sort of flip through these lovely applications of the same thing over and over. As I flip through this, to get here, I think you guys are, I would imagine, an audience who would be interested in understanding, okay, I get it, but how? Again, that's my least favorite question, is the technical side of things. The why is the most important, but how is sort of like comes secondary. But if you're curious about the how, and here's that generator. If you're curious about the how, what this came down to was, again, calculation. And I couldn't find the thing on my piece of paper that actually showed me figuring this out. But what this was drawing the letter forms in as many ways as possible, getting other people to draw those letter forms, and then understanding the inherent mathematical qualities of these letter forms. Yeah. I hear someone talking, just mute. Thank you so much. So it's understanding the angles. It's understanding, if you guys ever use the path tool in Illustrator or Figma, it's understanding the angles of those lines and then feeding it into code and then telling the code to doing many different parameters, different types of randoms, different ranges to throw these random values into, like all random design is. And then finally, just sort of like allowing the code to do the rest. Now, what this identity did, just to sort of wrap this up, is that it's sort of like using code, it sacrificed my role as the designer. I'm not the one who's dictating the shape of these letter forms, the code is, and that's how the design itself can be poetic, which is really nice. Now let's go on to chapter 4. This one's called You're Just Going to Have to Make One Up Part 2. And this takes us to today. And we'll go through what today looks like. I remember mom said, you're just going to have to make one up. So GBA came out and many other projects that I was working on the side while I was also working at Pentagram. I was also giving a lot of talks, and I was also meeting a lot of designers. And when I was doing this, I discovered that the entire world of design around me was sort of like looking for this opportunity to understand how coding can be a part in their design. I wasn't the only one. Suddenly I woke up and the world around me was asking the same questions that I had been asking for several years. This takes me to why and how I started Cotton. I left Pentagram because I wanted to, my number one sort of like business decision for Cotton to start it. I said the world didn't need another agency, but I did say that I think the world needs a home for designers who want to code and do the same sort of thing that I've been doing for years and understand things there. Here's just like a quick reel of some things that we've been working on in the past year or 8 months. Now, to do this, I wanted to make sort of an announcement to the world, and that this is a thing now. And you know, with any announcements, you really want to wow people, especially with design. And as some of you may have seen, for that sort of like announcement, I created a reel of almost 10 of these sort of like coded typography things that say Cotton. And I'm going to show them to you in the order of difficulty of making them a reality. This was the first one, and this is the one that when I look at this, I cringe. This does the one thing that I hate when people do, which is take a beautiful typeface and destroy it by pixelating it and making it interaction. Why don't you just use the typeface as itself, and why don't you just make a typeface that sort of does this thing? I was in the 11th hour and I had spent all this time on all these other things, and I said, okay, you know, this is what we're going to do. And I tried to use, you know, interpolating and other things to make it a little bit more interesting, but this one is boring. Tetris was also surprisingly quite boring. The rules of Tetris and the computation to make Tetris actually a thing, that's something that's been around since the dawn of computing, just game design in general. What was nice about this was my realization that Tetris could actually have letters in them. And luckily, Cotton has 6 letters in it, which isn't that many. But I quickly found out just by playing this game that it makes a really, really hard game of Tetris to play with something that always has 6 blocks. That was number 2. It wasn't so hard because of Tetris existed. Number 3, this was basic principles. I think this took me just a couple hours to do. You click something, it sort of goes up, and then once it reaches a certain threshold, it then sort of multiplies and creates other things. Very easy. We start to get in an interesting zone here. This one looks very simple, but to get here, this isn't using the canvas. This was using CSS clipping paths, where all of these elements are kind of like they're within certain things, and the circle that comes out of it is being built off of the origin of the clicker. Relative of this one, which uses the exact same principle, but just a little bit differently. This one I called raise. This is a lot of different clipping paths. And what I had to understand was sort of like, how do you figure out the calculation of what these points are going to be based on? Because if you see these points here all around on the side, those things are kind of like moving around. It's not just one location. It's all just kind of like a little bit more mathematical. Now we get to an interesting zone. This one sort of like followed the cursor and needed to create something and draw something at the same time. This one was really hard. This one, remember that page with sketches of my typographic variable typeface in the browser? This sort of like helped me to get to this. I had to literally design this variable typeface using, this may have been the canvas or may not have been, I don't remember, but just understanding again, those letter forms and how they behave. And last but not least, this one, which was days and days and days of frustration. And what was particularly frustrating about this was the fact that, see how every single one of these colors has kind of like a black line around it. So it has to sort of like remember where it was and create this interesting shape. Now, if you asked me to do this, I would know. But at the time it was, you know, as always, we're always sort of like pushing ourselves to new, interesting things. Now, so working as a designer in my own, in an agency, the project started off very experimental. Here was one with, a very early project we did just to begin. This was a design, this was a restaurant and bar here in New York City that's opening up quite soon. They are on multiple floors. So we wanted to create something that sort of alluded to that. We liked the idea that the signature at the bottom of the line is always illegible. So to reflect that and to go even deeper, we said, what if the entire identity had something to do with the receipts that they passed out? To figure out the process. And this was, again, process is so important in getting to the right result. It wasn't just that it was inspired on 3 levels. We were thinking about how do we take this idea of the receipt and make it look like it's going up and down those letters. Now, we already had a logo and this wasn't it, but we said, how do we communicate this concept in other ways? And this was the general idea, is that these 3 floors and maybe the word Madeline's or coming soon or something else is always kind of going up and down these things. It's a lovely little delightful moment on the site or within the brand, but it's nice that it kind of like the user is kind of controlling it, as if to say they themselves are going through this space. In the coming soon site, which we're finally doing the larger version coming out very soon, but the coming soon has a nice little moment on the site that's very cute. This is that same thing sort of like all blown up, and you see that it's just this lovely little moment where it's a little unexpected, it's a little bit playful, but I find that was kind of like in the beginning, and when making really good work, it's not just about that. You find that brands have larger questions and things have to work. One of the other ones that I've done since then is something called Elemental Accelerator. Now, they are a nonprofit investor in climate technologies with deep community impact. Community brings half the solution, technology brings the other half. And in this one, they have an event that they have every year for investors to raise money. For this one, the idea was simple. It was focus on those 3 things: community, technology, and elemental. They're sort of like color palette. With all of these things, put it together, and the building blocks of this event, which was, by the way, they had a design team of 0 to carry out this event, so it had to be a seamless system. To create sort of like letter forms that are made up of these things, as if to say, okay, in order to create the messaging and the words and the ideas that inspire us, we need a little bit of everything. We need a little bit of community, we need a little bit of environment, and we need a little bit of technology. A logo comes into play, but where this thing really sort of started to feel right was in this idea of, and again, sort of like bringing meaning into this. If the idea is that you're always kind of like changing these conversations and combining different forms of technology and community and climate, the idea is that we want to communicate is that you can combine any of those things to create your own, choose your own adventure of fixing climate change. And this is sort of where you get. The idea definitely carried out on static graphics. You put things all together like this. But where this started to really come through is in creating an interactive design system for the typography. Now you see some of the interaction over here. This is sort of the year kind of like changing here. But then we created a system of 4 different ways of creating this almost like interactive generative typography. You have things flashing, things moving around, different ways of that. And last but not least with this, it was about creating an entire interactive typeface that the team could then use to really communicate that idea the most. On the night before the final presentation for this, I took this concept and I said, oh, well, we got to make a generator for them. So the night before we said, well, why don't we make our first sort of like interactive typeface so that people can not just see the interaction happening, they can also create it in live time. Now, I know we are at more or less running out of time, so I'm just going to skip sort of to this last bit. This chapter is called Waiter, There's a Bug in My Code. And the way the joke goes that I've heard it growing up is, waiter, there's a fly in my soup, and the waiter says, shh, everyone will want one. And that's sort of like a play here, as if to say that bugs are actually maybe good. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Bugs are good because, well, you'll see. And my new thing that I'm thinking about is that the trends of the web are directly correlated to new advancements in CSS. Lately, we're seeing a lot of border radius. We're seeing a lot of like curved edges on things. Lately, we're seeing a lot of that like transparent glass technique. A lot of it. We're seeing a lot of that in design websites. And all of that is because of what is now possible as a property in CSS or as a function in JavaScript. And we see that once that becomes possible, suddenly everyone starts to do it. Designers push new visuals, developers beyond that, do what's really hard. If you're doing what's really hard, that just means that the developers will follow. This is something that I've been working on that's coming out in a couple weeks. This is something called counter-archiving the avant-garde. And the idea is that users go into the site and it's an archive, but it's a counter-archive because it's them going in and collectively marking up how to shift the dialogue of this archive. You can add quotations, you can add tags, you can change the text itself. The result is this really beautiful sort of like canvas of conversation and dialogue. It's really nice. This is sort of like a screen grab of where the landing page is. This is basic. This is like after doing, years of this stuff, this came together in an afternoon. But really the hard part starts to come when you actually have to allow people to highlight things and change things. This is sort of it's in its current state. This is something that it's really hard to now to do this with typography. And there are a lot of other projects that I'm working on that are really hard to do with code. And sort of, I think the last message that applies to you guys and applies to me and applies to everyone is that when the computation is hard, when it's hard to get somewhere, that just means it's not always going to be hard. What you are doing is you are creating the designs that the developers who create CSS and create JavaScript will say, this is now something that we need to make a little bit easier for people. Don't follow the technology, make technology follow you. That's kind of what I'm trying to do. Next time, we'll talk about computation in business. But until then, thank you so much, everyone, for your time and your attention.
Everyone, big applause. Thank you so much, Talia. Yay. Wow. I'm really curious about the slides you skipped, but also the other slides were great. Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes for Q&A. There's a lot of questions. I'm sorry if we cannot answer your question and you posted it in the chat. So OESFIN asked, what are the most useful mathematical concepts for designers or creative coders to understand?
Oh, great question. That's a first question I've ever been asked that. I would say just right off the bat, I would say trigonometry. Review your SOHCAHTOA, review your. I think just the very basic exercise that I would give you is have a bar in the middle of the page and have the bar rotate to find where the cursor is. You can look it up how to do that. You can make ChatGPT do it for you. But I think if you're really exercising how to figure out math, do some calculations, look up SOHCAHTOA, look up sine, cosine, tangent, and understanding those things. I think with that idea of rotation and directionality, that's sort of like the first thing where I would start.
That's great. Nice. I need to update that too. And Sean asks whether you generally lean more on CSS or JavaScript when you make the websites that you showed last.
As much as I can possibly rely on CSS, I will, because when it comes to delivering a final product, every line of JavaScript and every function of JavaScript slows everything down. If it can work with CSS, that's better. There's a lot of things, though, that, again, are just not going to be possible in CSS. So that's, I love JavaScript. I love JavaScript. So I try to, I love using JavaScript, but I try not to use it whenever I can. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And then Claudius also, he asked about generative type, but this is maybe I'm going to bend this question a bit towards what I'm wondering, but do you know of any open source repos for CSS, like CSS animations or sort of the most low-key animations, like the most minimal code animations?
I don't.
Oh,
I don't know the answer
cool.
to that.
That's
A
a
lot of
quick
the things-
answer.
Yeah, a lot. The longer answer is I rely very, 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 very little on existing libraries and existing repos and things. I try to do it myself because I think, first of all, if I'm doing it myself, chances are, this is not a direct reasoning, but it may just be more creative if I'm making it myself. I'm not relying on something that already exists. There may be opportunity to make something, but also in that creation process. And we know this from just like moving pixels around the page. In that creation process, you then discover new things that was a starting point, but you can then turn it into something else.
Nice. So you talked a bit about like sort of new technologies making new things available, but do you ever run into the opposite where things that you use become obsolete? And how do you deal with that? That's a question that Charles asked.
Such good questions today. Love you guys. The answer, the quick answer is absolutely. That's like the history of technology. I think the idea is when you code something, in a way, the simpler it is, the better. If I were to just use HTML is not going to become obsolete anytime soon. So the simpler, the less likely it will become obsolete, but things do happen. I think specifically, honestly, in my own history, the things that have become obsolete are less CSS and JavaScript related actually, and more to do with like CMSs and frameworks and libraries and things. So I guess that also, thinking out loud a little bit, that kind of answers that former question a little bit more. I think the more you rely on things that are frameworks and whatnot, the less it's going to be native or vanilla to the code itself. I don't believe principles in CSS and principles in JavaScript ever become obsolete. There become better ways of doing things. But I think with those technologies, it always just builds on what already exists. So the more you rely on those, the better.
Nice. Do you ever, this is not a question someone asked, but did you ever use like inline CSS in HTML? No.
Absolutely not.
Great. Okay, good.
No,
because it's still...
inline CSS still works. Like it works. I think yeah, one of the best lessons I ever learned when I was in school was someone told me, I don't care what the code looks like as long as it works. And I think that's the thing that designers get hung up on a little bit. It's when you're a developer, when you're working for Facebook and developing their apps, your code matters. What your code looks like matters because you're working on a team of thousands of developers. That matters, and you have to follow their standards for coding. When you're just making something that's just supposed to be beautiful and experimental and doing something different, it doesn't matter at the end of the day what the code looks like. Yes, it has to run quickly, and yes, it has to be something that you can probably understand in a year's time. But generally, if that is your limitation, I don't care. I just care what it looks like and that it's a functional, beautiful, reasoning design.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. So I think we have time for one more question. There was a question by Goblin Captain. Great name. How do you see the job of, your own job in the future? We have things like ChatGPT, and then also the no-code movement is doing like coding for a part of us. Do you see like how will that look like in the future for you?
The ChatGPT is a really easy one. That's two questions in one. The question is, what does it look like in the future? The second question is, what about ChatGPT? Let's answer the easier one. ChatGPT is very good. ChatGPT is very good because it makes the tedious processes faster. ChatGPT will not give you a brilliant, amazing design. When I find that ChatGPT is limited, and if I'm on my 7th time prompting it to do the same thing and it's still getting it totally wrong, I'm like, yes, this means that it is very hard for an AI to understand the visual of what's trying to come out. This is my place to say, yes, my design is good. My design is original. My design is something that's breaking some sort of boundary. So I definitely encourage ChatGPT. I don't encourage it for beginner yet. I don't yet encourage it for beginner learners of code because I think understanding the principles first is really important. The metaphor that I give is when you guys are learning math in school, there is a certain point where your teachers say, calculator is required for class and you have to use it in all of your tests. But until that moment, you're not allowed to touch a calculator. You have to learn addition and subtraction and division and fractions and all these things first. So learn your coding, learn your HTML, learn your CSS, learn your JavaScript. And then once you're flying, start to use ChatGPT for the basic things and then turn it into something that's different. The other question was about the future, and that's something I think about a lot, because the future is always changing really, really, really rapidly, especially in design and technology. You can't predict it. I just think that the thing that that I always go back to is that if the concept is good, if the idea is good, if it communicates an idea, if it solves a problem, I don't care how it gets there. It's less about the coding, it's less about the technology. It's more about how do we do this? How do we communicate this idea or solve something different?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's also actually exactly what you said. Yeah, Talia, this was so great. I think we have to invite you another time so that we can hear more about the branding. But
Yeah.
this was really, really amazing and insightful. And thank you for making a custom lecture for us with a great title. Thank you, everyone. Sorry that we didn't get to answer all the questions. I posted Talia's website and her studio's website here in the chat. And yeah, we'll post this recording after the series is over. I hope you all have a great day and see you next week.
Everyone. Thank you, Vera. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, everyone, for being here. If you have a question that wasn't answered, find me on Instagram. It takes me a long time to respond because I'm running a business, but I will respond. And thank you again so much for being here, everyone. Bye, everyone.
Bye.